4 years ago, Vladimir Putin said Ukraine would fall in 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned into 4 years. And right now, we're face to face with a truth the Kremlin will never openly admit. There is silence on Russia's northern front. But in the south, a completely different picture. Ukrainian forces have reclaimed over 400 square kilometers of territory since January 2026. Don't underestimate that number. For the first time since the Kursk operation, Ukraine is gaining more ground per month than it's losing. As we enter March 2026, the balance of this war has begun shifting in exactly the opposite direction from what was expected. So how did this happen? And more importantly, can Putin even see this picture? Because what's happening inside the Kremlin's own command structure reads like the script of a war film. Is Ukraine's counterattack a disaster? Or is the real disaster somewhere else entirely? The answer will make you think. War accounting is cold work. But to understand it, you have to go inside the numbers. As of February 2026, according to figures released by Ukraine's General Staff, Russian forces have suffered approximately 1.2 million casualties since the start of the war, killed, wounded, and missing combined. Alexandra Prokopenko from the Carnegie Russia and Eurasia Center confirmed this figure, noting that the number of Russian soldiers killed alone is approaching 325,000. This is an estimate also validated by SIZE, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi made this statement in early March 2026. Over 3 months of winter, a total of 92,850 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded. That is an average of 1,031 people per day. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte confirmed last month that Russia lost more than 30,000 soldiers in December 2025 alone. That's 30,000 people. In a single month. For minimal territorial gain. Laying out this picture matters. Because the Kremlin's propaganda machine tells a very different story. And part of the world continues to believe that story. But the numbers show something else. On the Ukrainian side, the picture is different but equally heavy. SIZE data indicates Ukraine has also suffered between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties, with 100,000 to 140,000 killed. An honest account requires stating this: both sides are paying a horrific price in this war. But the question is, who can keep paying that price, and for how long? In the final week of February 2026, SW, the Institute for the Study of War, made a striking finding: Ukrainian forces reclaimed more territory in the last 2 weeks of February than Russia had seized. This was the first time since the major counteroffensive of 2023 that this had occurred. So where are these territories? Primarily along the boundary line of Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. Ukrainian forces in this region first halted Russian groups advancing with infiltration tactics starting in early January, then pushed them back. But here's what's truly interesting: Russia couldn't even properly track its own retreat. NV Ukraine analyst Kevliak shared a detail sourced from intelligence. An inspection team from Russia's 29th Army arrived at the headquarters of the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade and examined the combat map. Then they conducted drone reconnaissance flights over the same area. The result? The front line shown on the map did not match the actual front line. Russian forces were holding a much smaller portion of the area they believed they controlled. Small infiltration groups had drawn the front line based on their own positions, but between these groups there was neither tactical communication nor command cohesion. When Ukrainian forces launched counterattacks, these groups were easily isolated and neutralized. In the Bilohyrya and Mala Tokmachka areas south of Zaporizhia, Russian forces repeatedly attempted to advance toward Orikhiv, and failed every time. Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army is now forced to repel Ukrainian counterattacks rather than sustain its own offensive. In the language of the front line, that represents a serious strategic shift. At this point, let's turn to perhaps the least discussed but most critical dimension of this war. In recent years, Russia had begun using Starlink terminals heavily in its military operations on the battlefield. Yes, the satellite internet system owned by Elon Musk's company. But how? Starlink terminals obtained through various channels were providing Russian forces with a critical advantage, both in frontline communications and in extending the range of drones to carry out deep strikes behind Ukrainian lines. ISW reports from February 2026 revealed that this access had been blocked. And the effect was felt immediately. Russian forces became unable to sustain their tempo and depth of attack. Ukraine exploited this gap, launching localized counterattacks along the Dnipropetrovsk-Zaporizhzhia boundary and making significant advances across a wide geography in a short period of time. Russia found temporary workarounds, local SIM cards, relay drones, but according to ISW, these mechanisms could not compensate for the capacity Starlink had provided. War is now being won or lost not just on physical terrain, but in the electromagnetic spectrum and satellite infrastructure. And in that domain, the balance shifted unexpectedly. Ukraine's own investment in drones must also be read in this context. Former Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, now Secretary of the Security Council, made this admission. In 2025, Ukrainian air attacks targeting Russia reached 23,000. That's nearly 4 times the figure of 6,200 in 2024. During the same period, actions Russia categorized as sabotage and terrorist attacks rose 40% to 1,830. These numbers came from Russia's own mouth. And they show that Ukraine has increased its warfighting capacity, built its own production infrastructure independent of the West, and begun deploying long-range unmanned aerial vehicles effectively. Front lines are determined not just by land, but by infrastructure. On this front, Ukraine is making increasingly bold moves. In March 2026, it was confirmed that Ukraine carried out a coordinated strike with approximately 200 drones on the port of Novorossiysk. Footage showed an oil terminal in flames and 6 of 7 tankers moored in the port sustaining damage. That same night, a strike was carried out on the Albashneft refinery in the Krasnodar region. Multiple fuel tanks and pipelines were destroyed. 2 days later, the Aviastar aircraft factory in Ulyanovsk was struck. This facility produces Russia's transport and tanker aircraft. Earlier, the Kremlin factory in Bryansk was hit with Storm Shadow missiles. That facility, as described by Ukraine's General Staff, is one of Russia's largest producers of military microelectronics. Ukraine is also pursuing a long-term strategy targeting Russia's energy infrastructure. According to October 2025 data, Ukrainian drone strikes began pressing on oil refinery capacity representing roughly 40% of Russia's total. More than 70% of capacity constraints were directly linked to these strikes. At this point, a question demands asking, why can Russia not adequately respond to these strikes? The answer is both military and economic. Let's move to the economic dimension now. Alexandra Prokopenko from the Carnegie Russia and Eurasia Center, in an analysis published in February 2026, described the Russian economy as being in the death zone. This term, borrowed from mountaineering, describes an altitude above which the human body deteriorates faster than it can repair itself. According to Prokopenko, Russia is at exactly that point, steadily destroying its future capacity while keeping itself upright. When Fortune magazine highlighted this assessment, it paired it with the following data. In January 2026, Russia's oil revenue fell 50% compared to the same period the previous year. The budget deficit continues to widen despite tax increases imposed on citizens. Inflation is climbing. The possibility of a payments crisis in the banking sector is being discussed. And it is projected that the liquid assets of the National Wealth Fund may be depleted by mid-2026. According to Moscow Times reporting, Russia's value-added tax rate was raised from 20% to 22% effective January 1st. The threshold for entering the VAT system was dramatically lowered, from 60 million rubles annually to 10 million. This represents a serious burden for small and medium-sized businesses. All of these measures show that households and businesses are being taxed to replenish the war chest. According to information obtained by the Washington Post, officials from Kremlin circles are warning Putin with increasing alarm that a financial crisis could arrive as early as summer. An anonymous Russian official said, "A banking crisis is possible. A payments crisis is possible. I don't even want to think about the war continuing or escalating." A Moscow-based businessman also told the Post, the crisis could come in 3 to 4 months. Restaurants are closing. Thousands of workers are losing their jobs or being placed on unpaid leave. Russia's GDP growth fell to 1% in 2025, and the IMF projects a similar growth rate for 2026. Compared to pre-war averages consistently above 4%, these figures point to a dramatic slowdown. Military spending, meanwhile, reached 7.3% of GDP in 2025. Defense Minister Belousov confirmed this figure directly. With GDP calculated at approximately $2.72 trillion, that expenditure equates to roughly $198 billion. And this money is not increasing the supply of consumer goods, on the contrary, it is fueling inflation. Now let's look at a striking pattern inside Russia's military hierarchy. Colonel Erich Selimov, commander of Russia's 136th Motor Rifle Brigade, was killed in a traffic accident in Luhansk Oblast in March 2026. That alone is not significant. But we also know this: the same brigade is under investigation for allegedly using chemical agents in Vovchansk, Kharkiv Oblast. Ukrainian officials announced they had gathered evidence documenting the brigade's use of chemical agents between September 2024 and June 2025. Command cadres are weakening. According to ISW's assessment, Russia is now using the 58th Combined Arms Army in the Zaporizhia region not to sustain offensive operations, but to repel Ukrainian counterattacks. The shift from attacker to defender, in the language of the front line, that carries enormous meaning. Ukrainian President Zelensky, meanwhile, has been making sweeping decisions within his own structure. Ukraine's Internal Security Service, Chief Vasyl Malyuk was removed from his post. The Border Guard's commander was replaced. In the fourth year of the war, an administrative restructuring process is underway, and this is the signal not of a collapse, but of an institutional transformation. There is a dimension to the war's narrative that is frequently overlooked: Ukraine's defense industry. 4 years ago, Ukraine was dependent on the West for weapons. Today, it has built its own production infrastructure. Long-range drones. Naval unmanned vehicles, which have delivered serious blows to Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Reports emerged from Russia that surface drones had targeted Russian LNG tankers from the Libyan coast. Ukraine announced it had destroyed more than 44,000 Shahid-type drones of Iranian origin. These same Shahid-type drones were transferred to Russia from Iran under license, and Russia has begun producing them domestically under that license. These same drones are now reportedly being directed toward Gulf states. Zelensky, aware of this, stated in his address to the British Parliament, Ukraine cannot remain indifferent to this threat. In response, more than 200 Ukrainian specialists were sent to Gulf nations, to provide training in protection against Iranian-made drones. This move shows that Ukraine is no longer just a belligerent, it is an actor in the field of regional security. And this prestige is converting into diplomatic leverage. In Europe, a quiet but deep fracture is occurring. NATO is growing with new members. Ukraine is taking concrete steps on the path to EU membership. European defense spending is reaching record levels. Finnish President Stubb spoke plainly at the World Economic Forum: Russia must continue the war, because this war has grown too large for Putin to end in failure. Now let's look at the strategic framework of Ukraine's operation in the south. Because this operation is not a simple reclaiming of territory. Military analysts summarize Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi's operational plan as follows: 2 simultaneous objectives. First, to liberate all of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. This is a target that is both symbolically and strategically critical. Second, to stabilize the front near Zaporizhia. If these two objectives are achieved together, Ukraine gains defensive depth in the south and positions itself far more powerfully at any negotiating table. Military analyst Mashevets made this assessment: the southern operation succeeded in slowing and binding Russia in the Huliapol and Oleksandrovsk sectors. At the same time, it prevented Russia from consolidating the gains made through infiltration tactics in autumn 2025. In short, Ukraine both reclaimed ground and left what Russia still holds in a more vulnerable state. This picture shows that the front has a multi-layered dynamic. Analyzing it by looking only at raw territory maps means seeing only the surface of the reality. In an operational assessment published by ISW in early January 2026, a striking account from a Ukrainian soldier serving near Pokrovsk was included. Russian forces use black camouflage techniques to conceal themselves in snow-covered terrain. They advance in groups of 5 or 6, equipped with electronic warfare and counter-drone weapons. The objective: let 2 or 3 of these groups reach Ukrainian positions. The others die in the fighting. The Ukrainian soldier described this tactic as the zombie tactic. On the front line, it is also called meat waves. Defense industry analysts compare this approach to the Stalinist philosophy of quantity before quality. Rand Corporation, in an analysis published in February 2026, examined the lasting effects of this kind of war on Russian society. Soldiers returning from the front are struggling to readjust to civilian life on incomes far below their combat pay. Psychological support infrastructure is inadequate. Social services are under pressure. Crime rates are rising. And Russia is projected to face a shortfall of 2.4 million workers by 2030, a significant source of that shortfall being young men killed on the front. According to WHO data from 2019, the life expectancy of a 15-year-old boy in Russia was on par with Haiti, below Mali, Yemen, and South Sudan. That was before the war. What will happen after the war is difficult to predict. But it will certainly get worse. Russia is finding it increasingly difficult to manage its own domestic audience through this period. The RAND analysis makes this observation: from the very first days of the war, Putin worked to sustain the impression among Russian citizens, especially those in Moscow and St. Petersburg, that the conflict had not penetrated their daily lives. Entering the 4th year, that effort is becoming less and less effective. Ukraine strikes on military installations, refineries, and infrastructure inside Russia are now unavoidably making the news. Western sanctions are reaching every segment of the economy. One telling indicator: in March 2026, approximately 28 drones approaching Moscow forced the closure of 3 major airports: Vnukovo, Domodedovo, and Zhukovsky. More than 200 flights were cancelled. Moscow residents now accept this as routine. 4 years ago, it would have been unimaginable. Kremlin propaganda is growing more complex in response. On one hand, the narrative that the war is going well. On the other hand, Russians who want the war to end. According to a Russian field poll, in February 2026, 53% of Russians said peace negotiations should begin. Only 38% supported the continuation of the military operation. Compared to the levels seen at the start of the war, this represents serious erosion. How does the Kremlin manage this picture? By strengthening the apparatus of repression. According to RAND's assessment, Russia has built an increasingly comprehensive mechanism of repression in recent years. The country is entering an ever-deepening cycle of tyranny, and breaking that cycle appears unlikely as long as the Putin regime continues. One of the least discussed dimensions of this war is the third parties feeding the war economy. ISW reports have repeatedly emphasized that the People's Republic of China continues to be a critical supplier for Russia's war effort. Semiconductors, dual-use technologies, microchips. When Russia's connections to Western countries were severed, China filled that gap. But this relationship is not one-directional. Some Russian analysts carry the concern that China is also using this supply process to monitor Russian intelligence structures. An asymmetry within an alliance. North Korea is an actor that has been confirmed as supplying Russia with soldiers and munitions, and its presence in the picture moves this war beyond a simple Russia-Ukraine bilateral conflict into a much wider geopolitical frame. The Iran dimension also carries special significance. It is known that Iran has sold Shahid-type drones to Russia since 2022 and that Russia has begun producing these drones domestically under license. Ukraine announced it had shot down more than 44,000 of them. But the production rate of Shahid may be outpacing the destruction rate. This equation continues to be a persistent challenge for Ukrainian air defense. Systematic strikes on Russia's energy infrastructure have been ongoing for 4 years now, but since 2025, Ukraine has experienced these strikes on its own territory as well, more intensely and more painfully. Zelensky announced in February 2026, every energy facility in Ukraine has been damaged in Russian strikes. Approximately half of the 12,000 residential buildings in Kiev lost heating. Let's make that concrete: 6,000 apartment buildings, without heat, in the middle of winter. Western military officials, in information passed to the Times of London, stated that at least 2/3 of Ukraine's energy production capacity had been destroyed or was under occupation. This human picture cannot be overlooked. And it should not be. Because the heaviest price in this war is being paid by civilian populations on both sides. On Russia's side, Ukrainian strikes produced similar results. Belgorod Oblast experienced interruptions lasting weeks. At the start of February, 100,000 Belgorod residents were left without water service. Power fluctuations caused by Ukrainian airstrikes triggered these outages. Before moving to the political picture, let's establish this. This war is now a game being played not only on the front line, but at the negotiating table as well. According to an Atlantic Council analysis from January 2026, President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky announced they had agreed on 90 to 95% of a peace proposal. Following this announcement, Putin claimed Ukraine had targeted his own residents. ISW and independent analysts questioned the accuracy of that claim. Ukrainian polls paint an interesting picture. Only 26% of Ukrainians believe negotiations will conclude successfully. Only 25% think current negotiations will lead to lasting peace. This rate shows how cautious public opinion has become. There is war fatigue, but no desire to surrender. On the Russian side, 61% support peace negotiations. This figure suggests the Kremlin is increasingly wrestling with internal pressure. Outside interventions are further complicating the picture. On the night of February 28, 2026, when the US carried out strikes against Iran in coordination with Israel, Russia acted with the expectation of condemnation of the attack. Lavrov offered to mediate. Putin called Gulf leaders to say Russia respects the sovereignty of states and does not interfere in the affairs of other states, while a territorial war was ongoing in Ukraine. This contradiction did not escape international public attention. Let's look at the 4-year balance sheet. According to ISW data, Russia has seized more than 29,191 square kilometers of territory in Ukraine since February 2022. This equates to approximately 13% of Ukrainian territory and includes Crimea and the pre-2014 Donbass regions. But this figure is no longer static. Ukraine is reclaiming ground. Looking at weapons inventories, the picture is as follows. Russia has lost 24,169 military vehicles and equipment, of which 13,904 were tanks and armored vehicles. Ukraine has suffered 11,496 equipment losses, of which 5,623 were tanks and armored vehicles. These numbers show that Russia's losses have reached approximately twice those of Ukraine. On the naval forces dimension, Russia has lost 29 naval vessels, Ukraine 42. Ukraine has not only avoided losing naval dominance, it continues to be a serious threat to Russia in the Black Sea. And this figure, holding a mirror to the human cost of 4 years of war, the UN confirmed 15,954 civilians killed in Ukraine. The real number is believed to be far higher, because verification from conflict zones remains extremely difficult. At this point, let's come to the most fundamental question of the war. Russia is sustaining staggering losses, the economy is collapsing, society is growing weary. So why doesn't the war stop? OMFIF analyst Mark Sobel gives a striking answer to this question. If Putin ends the war, he cannot hide the scale of the destruction. The Russian economy has become structurally dependent on military production. Demobilization means economic shock. Inflation is now visible. Debt is rising. Civilian production is weakening. If the war ends, this picture will be exposed in all its nakedness. And Putin consciously remembers the trauma of the Soviet collapse. During that period, GDP fell 40%. To prevent the repetition of that era, the war must continue. At least, according to the Kremlin's calculation. Fortune described the situation this way: the war has grown too large to fail. There is no strong economy to continue with. But there is strong fear about stopping. But let's return to the mountaineering metaphor. No climber can stay in the death zone forever. Some descend and survive. Others stay because they have no way out. Russia is now in the second situation. Wars usually end when both sides realize they can no longer win. Or with the collapse of one side. What do we see in today's picture? Ukraine entered 2026 with unexpected dynamism. A southern counteroffensive. Reclaimed territory. The capacity to strike deep into Russia with weapons of its own production. An EU membership perspective. Growing European support. And concrete evidence on the front line that Russia can no longer move with confidence. Russia, meanwhile, entered 2026 with deepening internal contradictions. Over 1.2 million casualties. An exploding budget deficit. Melting reserves. Growing social discontent. And a war machine compelled to keep turning, not because it's winning, but so it doesn't collapse from simply stopping. This picture doesn't mean the war is ending soon. But this picture clearly shows that the narrative of Russia is winning does not align with the actual data. And this picture reveals that in the fourth year of the war, the balance has begun quietly shifting. Putin said it would be over in 2 weeks. 4 years have passed. Ukraine is still standing. The front is being reclaimed. The economy has eroded. And the Kremlin cannot even coordinate with its own command staff about the trajectory of the war. The title of this video stood as a question at the beginning. The answer is neither a clear victory nor a clear ending. But in this war, something is now finished, the illusion that Russia would win swiftly. And that is perhaps the most critical sentence for understanding the course of this war.